Okay, in 1996, Copenhagen was the European capital of culture, like Aarhus will be next year. And one part of the extensive program for the summer 1966 was the Metropolis City Soundscape program, realized in collaboration between Westdeutscher Rundfunk, or West German Radio, Köln, and curated by the head of Studio Akustische Kunst, Klaus Schöning. The Metropolis City Soundscape featured 16 sound compositions, each of them titled with the name of a particular city and installed in the urban space of Copenhagen. The pieces were part of the Metropolis series that had been earlier on aired at West German Rundfunk, and most of them were commissioned by the Studio Akustische Kunst led by Klaus Schöning. For the Metropolis City Soundscape exhibition, the pieces were played back one by one from loudspeakers on specific locations in the harbourfront or in the city centre, allowing bypassers to listen in on sounds from Kyoto, San Francisco or Venice. And in the catalogue for the installation or exhibition, Klaus Schöning wrote that Sounds of the Earth Metropolises salute the Danish capital, this year's European cultural capital. They form acoustic bridges between cities of Europe and other continents. The city sounds of Copenhagen provide an ambience for these audio spaces and acoustic islands. The rather lofty statement gives an indication of the way in which this project was connected to a political economy in which the European capital comes to be the center of a network of world cities. And what I want to discuss in this paper is the relationship between locality and network in these and other related works for radio. What interests me is the way in which the urban is sounded and discursively framed in works for radio, like this Metropolis series from Studio Akustische Kunst. And I'll structure my presentation along two different approaches to the Metropolis project and to the radiophonic city portrait, the one being following an aesthetic context of the pieces, and the other one being following an institutional context. And I hope this will show that, it will demonstrate the relevance of understanding radiophonic art and particularly Ars Acoustica projects as a practice that, even though it resembles sound art in many ways, must also be seen in relation to the radio media and its specificities and institutionalized practices. I should also say that even though I had hoped to, I will not be able to include listening experiences other than to my voice in the presentation. So it will mainly be discussing the context of pieces like this. And as Carla just mentioned, I should say that it's a part of a larger HERA-funded research project focusing on transnational radio encounters. So first, discussing the aesthetic context of this Metropolis project. When Schöning describes the project in various publications and CD leaflets, he often mentioned as a predecessor Walter Rothmann's famous Wochenende or Weekend, commissioned by Berliner Funkstunde in 1928, an 11-minute montage, later also played back in a cinema. As you may know, the piece was produced with film footage, a technique that allowed Rothmann to cut and splice the material with great and unprecedented detail. As a much less well-known example of a similar practice is a piece called Contemporary Copenhagen in Radiophonic Images, produced by the Danish modernist writer Emil Bønnelykke for National Danish Radio and broadcast in December 1930 in the Danish radio. This piece was also shot on sound film and subsequently montaged for broadcasting. It featured different urban sounds. This is from the program description, ranging from bells, factory whistles, and machines at urban factories, and also to the zoo in Copenhagen and the train station. All montaged without sound, without words. The piece, however, is not preserved, but we know that the Danish radio magazines found it, for example, lifelike, but in lack of action, and it was considered an experiment, very amusing, but as institution barely recommendable. So it was not positively received by the general public. Clearly, the urban as a motive and as a sound repository fascinated the avant-garde and modernist artists of the 30s, maybe also influenced by, for example, Rosolo's Art of Noises manifesto. And with film as a material, the artists were able to achieve some of the abruptness and complexity that painters, writers, filmmakers, and other artists strived towards at the same time. In this context, it is hardly surprising that as early radio experiments were rediscovered gradually by the Neue Hörspiel in the 1970s, the genre of city portraits also reappeared. Klaus Schöning, the head of Studio Akustische Kunst in Köln, explicitly referenced Ruttmann's work when commissioning another of the pioneers of sounding art, Pierre Henry, to produce one of the first major pieces for the Metropolis series that I presented before, La Ville, die Stadt, Metropolis, Paris, from 1984. When Studio Akustische Kunst and Klaus Schöning reinvented the genre, of course, new technologies were available. They were not shot on film, but of tape, of course, and tape recorders were not even a new technology anymore. But clearly the radiophonic city images can be understood as a vehicle of modernism, one that seeks modern expressions for modern impressions. Yet also Schöning mentioned another point of inspiration as well, namely the concept of soundscape. And the Canadian composer and music educator Amaury Schaefer. As you probably know, Schaefer formulated a theory and a practical program around the concept of soundscape in the late 60s and early 70s. And his colleagues at the World Soundscape Project production, the Vancouver Soundscape from 1973, is, as you may have seen, included in the Metropolis series and famed with the category of a classic in the Metropolis City Soundscape catalog. Looking at Schaefer's theory, there's a very concrete relationship between locality and sound for Schaefer. The soundscape of a place expressed the character of that place, and at the same time condition, conduct, health, and mood for people frequenting the place. And while the soundscape thus offers a perspective to analyze society's soundscape composition, the production of sound collage based on recorded sound, for Schaefer offer an opportunity to raise critical awareness as well as to create what he calls idealized soundscapes. It is this basic assumption, the one that sound expressed the locality, which brings Schaefer to propose the concept of schizophrenia for the modern condition with electroacoustic technologies where, and I quote, sounds have been torn from their natural sockets, unquote. Schizophrenia, of course, is a negative concept for Schaefer, but it is one of many ironies and ambivalences at Schaefer's project that the compositional as well as the analytical practice of soundscape rely on such schizophronic technologies. I'm not making this point to tease soundscape theory, but because the concept of schizophrenia may or could be usefully employed for the strategy or some of the strategies we see in the radiophonic city portraits, for example, in the Metropolis series. It could be useful to think of such radiophonic city portraits as a way of rendering a particular quality of urban life where sounds and other phenomena or matter seem to be at once here and yet not here. Indeed, it is characteristic of urban environments that we hear sounds without being able to locate or even identify sounds, or the so-called natural sockets of these sounds. And as the sociologists of globalization have taught us, the forces that work in everyday environments today, urban environments today, may be equally well understood from analysis of global flows of money, people, and imaginaries than by investigating the contours of the local environments, as Schaefer did with the Vancouver soundscape in 1973. So what I'm aiming at, what I'm coming at, is to suggest that through the concept of schizophrenia, that we may be able to see the radiophonic city portraits also as a way of being able to hear and experience what Manuel Castells has called the space of flows, as opposed to the space of place. A space that incorporates influences that are not felt to be not necessarily felt to be close. And it is not without ambivalence that the pieces in the Metropolis series at once portray a particular city, each named with a particular name of the city, while at the same time aligning this city, be it Copenhagen, London, or Tokyo, with other cities in a series of metropolises, and often only allowing a few particular sound icons that point the listener to a particular place if the listener knows that sound, while much more prevalently offering general urban sounds that could be heard many places around the globe. And I'm behind here, okay. And just to mention one example, and I won't get time to play this, but one example of a strategy that works consciously with such an approach to the urban would be Pierre Henry's piece, La Ville die Stadt, Metropolis Paris, where instead of structuring the piece concerning or in relation to localities, it is structured in relation to particular sounds that are that could be heard in many cities. Okay, turning to the institutional context, I will investigate the radiophonic city portrait as embedded in institutional and particularly geopolitical contexts. When looking at pieces originating from or commissioned from European radio stations, it may be useful to consider how these are not embedded in the art institution's ideals of artistic autonomy, but rather in the media institution's ideals of national public service. Modeled on BBC's John Reid idea of broadcasters' obligation to inform, educate, and entertain, public service institutions must be understood to define themselves in relation to a perceived public, that of the nation. And while the art institution have a certain bias towards the historical, towards archives and historiographies, the public service media institution could be said to have a bias towards the geographical, toward delineating the territory, and of securing a public. Danish radio was until 1940 managed by the Ministry of Traffic and not, as today, by the Ministry of Culture. Broadcasting was, and still is to some extent, considered as a means to secure effective communication and cohesion within a nation. Now turning back to the example of Emil Bønneløkke's contemporary Copenhagen piece and considering its institutional framing, the piece was done by Bønneløkke by commission from the national broadcaster as a preparation for a prestigious series of collaborative city portraits involving Nordic broadcasters, even though the production generated quite a bit of public interest. Bønneløkke, as illustrated in the comments I gave you earlier on, Bønneløkke himself did not make many statements about the work, but Emil Holm, the head of Danish radio, did. And he said, "The intention is that we will continue this work, and when we in January next year embark on mutual exchanges with larger foreign cities, through which listeners in different countries will get a radiophonic view into the lives and physiognomy of cities in question, we will include at least parts of this sound film in the exchanges. Broadcastings of this kind may serve as propaganda for Copenhagen and for Denmark under hitherto unknown forms, and this use of sound film in the service of Radiophonic is the first not only in Denmark but in international radio in total." As Holm foresees, parts of the sound montage that Bønneløkke made was later included in another ambitious broadcasting from Danish radio, the one called The Nordic Countries Visiting Copenhagen by January 1931, a program that was simultaneously transmitted on all stations in Finland, Sweden and Norway and involved producers from all of the countries who were in Copenhagen during the broadcasting. It was the first of a ring of collaborative broadcasts that also featured Helsingfors, Stockholm and Oslo. As you see here, these four were even not the only ones of these prestigious city portraits aired in national radio in the Nordic countries in the early 30s. The work was clearly seen as a possibility to market Denmark and Copenhagen, and an extension to include Copenhagen in a network of related cities within the region of the Nordic, apropos what we heard earlier on. And it is interesting how the city portrait here was a prominent medium of a transnational collaboration and how it allowed for a national and regional character to be negotiated. Yeah. And even though Bønneløkke's approach was probably the most radical one compared to the other approaches, here you see some of the radio magazine's presentations of some of the other productions that are structured along a more touristic gaze and tour around the city. It still became a part of this way of organizing and aligning cities in the Nordic. So how can this context of institutional exchanges of city portraits in the early 30s inform my investigation of the radio city portrait as a genre and of the Metropolis project more specifically? Concerning the Metropolis project, it could draw attention to the fact that the series of productions that I illustrated earlier on was also incorporated in the early steps of an institutionalization, namely that of Acoustica International, or what was later termed Ars Acoustica. Prior to the City Soundscape installation in Copenhagen in 96, Schöning had organized 3 other Acoustica International events, and in 1989, the Ars Acustica was established as an expert group of broadcasters within the European Broadcasting Union. Seen in this context, the Metropolis series and its subsequent presentation not only in radio but at different events and installations could be seen to contribute to building an organization and a geographical infrastructure around the international language of city portraits and city sounds. One might, of course, notice how this international organization was heavily based on a wide and Eurocentric outlook to the world, and the portraits of, for example, Tokyo, Benares, Calcutta, were all produced by Western visitors to the cities. So, to sum up my paper, I hope to have kind of shown that it is valuable in approaching city portraits for radio, like the Metropolis series from Studio Akustische Kunst, to look not only at its aesthetic qualities and strategies, but also at its embedding within institutional and organizational frameworks. I'll argue that the pieces must be understood at least two levels. One, hearing in them the mobilization of strategies to inhabit contemporary urban environments, and two, seeing how such mobilizations are embedded in strategies of producing likeness and difference on a transnational level. What could be discussed, and what this is maybe for me only the beginning to discuss, is how this pointed focus on locality that lies in all these productions is at the same time a part of undermining the specificities of site and locality. And I guess with those words I will end this presentation.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions, and where's the other mic? There, okay, good. Just to know, so
That was really interesting. And it's so sad this work doesn't exist. Maybe it's in some archive somewhere. Hopefully it'll appear. Of course, there's a kind of parallel or slightly earlier history of city films, like Ruttmann's Die Große Stadt and Cavalcanti and etc. And also there's Man with the Movie Camera. When I think about the Pierre Henry piece, it's quite a funny piece because it's a bit more like a Man of the Movie Camera work, because it's not a soundscape in Murray Schafer style. He's very active in the studio and he's present, and you can hear him playing with the tapes backwards and things, and it's a funny piece.
Yeah. Well, but about the archive thing, I mean, some of them, as you clearly know, I mean, some of them are published. The Pierre Henry piece is published as a CD, and the Bill Fontana piece as well. But the other ones, there are excerpts of them different places, and I know they are in the German radio archive. I hope to.
I have a particular interest in the GPO Film Unit, which is a documentary film group in Britain in the 1930s, which did extraordinary, especially Humphrey Jennings' extraordinary use of sound, which is it's another story.
But there are clear. Well, yeah, I think that the parallel to film is something to investigate further. One part that I didn't include in this is an interesting discussion between, or maybe not between, but a critique that Michel Chion has of Schafer and the soundscape concept. In a brief text where he says that the idea of a specificity of a city sound does not correspond to his experience as a sound recordist all around the world, and he's kind of critical to that idea that each sound or each city should have its particular sound. He obviously claims that all cities sound alike from his experience. And I think, there is an interesting discussion along those lines, and I would say that, of course, obviously Pierre-Henri and the way he works is much more inspired by French tradition and a way of working with musique concrète and using material, recorded material as material for a compositional process, whereas, for example, Maurice Schaefer, but also Bill Fontana in the pieces included here, is much more interested in maintaining the originality of the recording.
When Klaus Schirling then commissioned Maurice Schaefer, he did Winter Diary, which is it's about empty landscapes in northern Canada in wintertime. It's not a city.
Right. Yeah. I mean, no, I would not. I would definitely not. I would not. I think I'm not really sure, but I think the Vancouver soundscape is the only, or at least the most kind of urban focused production that Maurice Schaefer did, and we probably all know that at some point during the 70s he left Vancouver and moved out to the countryside, and claiming that he was not interested in urban soundscape anymore. So there clearly is a critique of the urban in the Vancouver soundscape, but also in a lot of the soundscape original thoughts.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. 1 and 2. I don't know which way. I think it was here first and then afterward.
Thank you very much for that talk. It's very interesting. I was wondering, I feel like you were working around this a bit, and I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more explicitly about, because I think you're spot on about the elements, not only in sort of this dissemination of culture as an institutionally driven practice, but these recordings of contemporary Copenhagen and the 1930s and the time period as it is in interwar period, which of course was a different situation across this field of northern countries that you're looking at. And I just wondered the context of that and the context of these metropolis more recent projects. I think that it's interesting, and I'm not sure if you've seen any contextual parallels other than, I see a very strong sort of drive towards reaching out to tourism, which of course brings in its own exchanges and drives economies. But could you talk a little bit more about relations?
I mean, obviously the city portraits of the 30s are can very easily be seen in a kind of a geopolitical context of negotiating regionality, and as maybe, let me see. As you can see, there is what's interesting today. There is a delineation of the Nordic region as one, including Hamburg, the northern Germany, in the early 30s. Something that today would not, I mean, we would not think of the Nordic as including North Germany in that way. And clearly there is also the disappearance of North Germany, and also the disappearance of this practice later on in the 30s, when the political climate in Germany changes. So there is an aspect of negotiating who are we in the Nordic at this point in these collaborations. Of course, I mean, when then turning to the Metropolis series, it's a completely different kind of collaboration. I mean, we're not dealing with broadcasters visiting each other and broadcasting simultaneously to every or to all the publics involved, but rather with a production of a stack of similar pieces. And in that way, I mean, the geopolitical context or the geopolitical aspect is maybe more one of display of presenting, for example, in the Copenhagen European Capital of Culture, presenting this repository of cities as this is the kind of this is where Copenhagen reach out to. These are the kinds of cities that reach into Copenhagen. So I guess in that way, it is a map of simultaneous or likeness, but also of who has the right to make a city portrait of Tokyo or of Buenos Aires, of Cologne and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know if that. Yeah.
I think actually these were very nice concluding remarks, and I would be very nice to extend this whole discussion into the lunch break, the much deserved lunch break. And thank you very much for wonderful speakers and a wonderful audience.